The radio crackled with static across the pre-dawn darkness of Forward Operating Base Kestrel, Afghanistan. Staff Sergeant Maria, Reaper, Vasquez sat in the briefing tent, her calloused fingers wrapped around a lukewarm cup of coffee that had long since lost its appeal. The mission parameters scrolled across the tactical display in harsh green light, casting shadows across her weathered face. 27 years old, 5'4", with eyes that had seen too much and a jaw that never quite relaxed anymore. The briefing officer, a fresh-faced lieutenant whose uniform still held creases from the factory, cleared his throat nervously. Intelligence indicates a high-value target compound approximately 40 clicks northeast of our position. SEAL Team 7 has been conducting reconnaissance for 72 hours. They've requested immediate close air support for extraction after successful target acquisition. Reaper Squadron Leader, Major Davidson, leaned back in his metal folding chair with the kind of casual arrogance that came from flying desk missions for the past 3 years. His voice carried that particular tone reserved for situations he deemed beneath his expertise. Weather's marginal at best, ceilings dropping, visibility's shit, and we've got potential surface-to-air threats in the area. This isn't a milk run, Vasquez. She knew what he wasn't saying, what he never said directly, but what hung in the air like cordite after a firefight. The unspoken question that followed her from base to base, mission to mission. Could a woman really handle the pressure when American lives hung in the balance? Could she maintain her composure when the enemy was shooting back? The tactical radio suddenly burst to life with urgent transmissions. Overwatch, this is Neptune 7. We are compromised. Repeat, we are compromised. Taking heavy fire from multiple positions. Immediate extraction required. Over. The voice belonged to someone young, scared, and very far from home. Reaper recognized the particular strain in those words, the kind that came when training collided with reality and found itself wanting. She'd heard it before, in her own voice, during her first deployment when her Black Hawk had taken RPG fire over Helmand Province. Davidson straightened, suddenly professional. Neptune 7, this is Overwatch. Stand by for support options. He turned to address the room, but his eyes lingered on Reaper with unmistakable skepticism. We need someone who can punch through whatever they're throwing up there. Weather's deteriorating rapidly, and intelligence suggests mobile SAM sites. The silence stretched like a held breath. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the tent fabric with increasing urgency. Reaper could hear the distant rumble of artillery, the ever-present reminder that war never truly slept. She thought about the voices on the radio, about young men trapped in a hostile landscape, counting down the minutes until either salvation or something far worse arrived. Through the open tent flap, she could see her, Thunderbolt II sitting on the tarmac, its distinctive twin engines and armored cockpit catching the first hints of dawn. The aircraft looked almost predatory in the half-light, nose painted with the distinctive shark teeth that had become her personal trademark. 37 confirmed kills marked its fuselage in small white silhouettes. Staff Sergeant Maria Reaper Vasquez stood up slowly, her flight suit rustling in the sudden quiet. Every eye in the tent turned toward her, measuring, calculating, doubting. She'd been here before, not just in this tent, but in this moment. The moment when everyone wondered if she had what it took. The moment when she got to prove them wrong. Her voice cut through the tension with surgical precision. I'll take it. Davidson's expression shifted from skepticism to something approaching resignation. He'd seen her personnel file, knew her statistics, understood her capabilities on paper. But paper was one thing, and the gray zone between life and death was something else entirely. Vasquez, this isn't a training exercise. These are real bullets, real SAMs, real consequences. With respect, sir, Reaper replied, her tone carrying the weight of 8 years in combat zones. They always are. The briefing officer fumbled with his tactical tablet, pulling up weather reports that painted an increasingly grim picture. Wind shear, low visibility, possible icing conditions. The kind of flying weather that turned routine missions into obituaries. Current conditions show ceiling at 800 feet and dropping. Visibility less than 2 miles and deteriorating. Recommended minimum for close air support operations is. I know the minimums, Reaper interrupted quietly. I also know what happens when good people wait for perfect conditions. Major Davidson studied her face in the green glow of the tactical displays. Maria Vasquez had earned her call sign the hard way, during a particularly brutal engagement in Syria, where she'd single-handedly neutralized an entire enemy convoy that had pinned down a Marine reconnaissance unit. The enemy had started calling her Al-Hassad, the Reaper, after that mission. Her own unit had adopted the name with pride. "You'll be going in alone," Davidson said finally. "No escort, no backup. If you get into trouble up there, you're on your own until we can scramble additional support." Reaper nodded once, sharp and decisive. She'd flown solo before, preferred it in many ways. No one to second-guess her decisions, no one to worry about except the people counting on her to bring the rain when they needed it most. Her A-10 was built for exactly this kind of mission. Low, slow, and deadly in the hands of someone who understood how to make every bullet count. The radio crackled again, more urgent this time. "Overwatch, Neptune 7. We've got wounded and we're running low on ammunition. Unknown number of enemy forces converging on our position. How copy?" Davidson looked at Reaper one final time, his expression unreadable. "Your aircraft, Sergeant. Bring them home." She was already moving toward the door, muscle memory taking over as her mind shifted into mission mode. Outside, the wind carried the scent of dust and aviation fuel, the familiar smell of bases in places where America sent its young to fight wars that older men started. Her crew chief, Technical Sergeant Rodriguez, was already performing pre-flight checks on her A-10, his movements efficient and practiced despite the early hour. "Morning, Reaper," Rodriguez called out as she approached. His voice carried genuine affection mixed with professional respect. Unlike many of the pilots who treated enlisted personnel as invisible, Vasquez had always made time to know the people who kept her aircraft flying. "Weather's looking pretty nasty, but she's ready to hunt." Reaper ran her hand along the aircraft's armored flank, feeling the slight vibration that indicated the APU was already running. The A-10 Thunderbolt II was an ugly aircraft by conventional standards, built around its massive GAU-8 Avenger cannon rather than for aesthetics. But to her, it was beautiful in its brutal functionality. 7 barrels of 30mm depth that could fire depleted uranium rounds at a rate of 65 per second. "Loadout?" she asked, though she already knew Rodriguez would have configured the aircraft exactly as she preferred for close air support missions. "Mixed bag," he replied, patting the pylons that held her external stores. "Maverick missiles on stations 3 and 9, cluster bombs on 5 and 7, and a full load of 30 Mike for the gun. Should be enough to ruin someone's day." Reaper pulled on her helmet, the familiar weight settling onto her shoulders like an old friend. The HUD display flickered to life, casting amber symbols across her vision. She could hear the radio chatter from the Tactical Operations Center, voices coordinating artillery fire and requesting updated intelligence on enemy positions. The familiar symphony of war, playing in frequencies only those who fought it could truly hear. Rodriguez stepped back as she completed her walk-around inspection, giving her the thumbs-up that indicated everything was ready for combat. "Bring our boys home, Reaper." She nodded, climbing into the cockpit with practiced efficiency. The A-10's cockpit was cramped but familiar, every switch and dial positioned exactly where her hands expected to find them. As she strapped in, Reaper could feel the weight of the mission settling onto her shoulders. Somewhere out there, American forces were counting the minutes, hoping that help would arrive before their ammunition ran out. The engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, a sound that had become synonymous with salvation for ground forces across 3 decades of conflict. Reaper ran through her pre-flight checklist with mechanical precision, each item confirmed and verified. Fuel, weapons, avionics, communication systems, everything green and ready for combat. Tower, this is Reaper 1 requesting immediate departure for close air support mission, she transmitted, her voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through her system. Reaper 1 Tower, you're cleared for immediate departure runway 27, winds 240 at 15, gusting to 25. Good hunting. The A-10 rolled forward, its twin General Electric TF-34 engines providing the steady thrust that would carry her into whatever hell awaited in the gray morning sky. As the aircraft gained speed down the runway, Reaper felt the familiar transformation that occurred every time she flew into combat. The doubts, the politics, the endless questions about her capabilities, all of it fell away, leaving only the mission and the skills she'd spent years perfecting. The aircraft lifted off into a sky the color of old pewter, heavy with clouds that promised worse weather to come. Below, the forward operating base shrank to a collection of geometric shapes arranged in the vast emptiness of the Afghan landscape. Above, somewhere in that gray void, enemy forces were moving into position to kill Americans who had trusted their government to bring them home alive. Reaper banked northeast, following the GPS coordinates that would take her to Neptune 7's last known position. The A-10 flew low and fast, its engines barely audible over the wind noise that penetrated even the heavily armored cockpit. She could feel the aircraft responding to her inputs with the precise obedience of a machine built for war, every control surface calibrated for the kind of flying that separated the living from the dead. The radio crackled with an updated transmission from the SEAL team, their position now confirmed and marked with infrared strobes that only friendly forces could see. Any station, this is Neptune 7. We are in contact with approximately 30 enemy personnel. Immediate close air support requested grid November Victor 774219. We are marked with infrared strobes, running low on ammunition and have 2 wounded. 30 enemies. Reaper processed the number as she adjusted her heading slightly, bringing the A-10 onto a direct intercept course. 30 fighters meant this wasn't a chance encounter. Someone had planned this ambush, positioned their forces with intelligence and purpose. The SEALs had walked into a carefully prepared kill zone, and now their lives depended on her ability to even the odds. The weather continued to deteriorate as she flew deeper into hostile territory, the ceiling dropping steadily and visibility shrinking to less than a mile. Flying in these conditions required absolute trust in instruments, the kind of faith that came only through thousands of hours of training and combat experience. One moment of doubt, 1 second of spatial disorientation, and the mission would end with a smoking crater instead of rescued Americans. Neptune 7, this is Reaper 1 inbound your position. Confirm infrared strobes are active and you can maintain visual separation from hostile forces. The response came immediately, relief evident even through the static and encryption. Reaper 1, Neptune 7. Strobes are active. We have clear separation approximately 200 meters north of our position. Hostiles are in prepared positions with heavy weapons. We count at least 2 machine gun nests and possible RPG teams. Reaper acknowledged the transmission while simultaneously updating her tactical display with the enemy positions. 200 meters, close enough that she'd need to be surgical with her weapons employment. The margin for error had just shrunk to nearly nothing, but that was exactly the kind of challenge that had earned her reputation as one of the most precise close air support pilots in theater. The A-10 punched through a low cloud layer, emerging into a pocket of relatively clear air that gave her visual contact with the ground for the first time since takeoff. Below, the Afghan landscape stretched out in shades of brown and gray, punctuated by the occasional green of irrigated fields. Somewhere in that maze of ridges and valleys, Americans were fighting for their lives. Her radar warning receiver suddenly lit up, indicating that someone on the ground was painting her aircraft with targeting radar. Surface-to-air missiles, just as intelligence had predicted. The distinctive warble of a SAM lock filled her headset, the sound that every pilot learned to fear during their first combat deployment. But fear was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. Neptune 7, be advised I'm showing SAM activity in your area. Can you confirm visual on any surface-to-air missile systems? Negative, Reaper 1. We've been taking small arms and RPG fire only, no visual on SAM sites. Which meant the missile systems were mobile, probably positioned specifically to engage any aircraft attempting to support the trapped SEAL team. Someone had planned this operation with considerable sophistication, and they'd prepared for the inevitability of American air power responding to the ambush. This wasn't just another firefight. It was a carefully orchestrated attempt to kill Americans and the pilots sent to save them. Reaper began a series of evasive maneuvers, using the A-10's relatively low speed and tight turning radius to complicate any missile solution the enemy might be developing. The aircraft bucked and shuddered through the turbulent air, but its robust construction absorbed the punishment without complaint. She could hear the engine's changing pitch as she varied her throttle settings, keeping her energy state unpredictable. The radio crackled with increasing urgency from the ground team. Reaper 1, Neptune 7, we are taking concentrated fire from multiple positions. 2 wounded, ammunition critically low. We need fires on target immediately. She was still 2 minutes out from visual contact, but those 2 minutes might as well have been 2 hours if the SEALs couldn't hold their position. Reaper made a decision that would have horrified her instructors back at flight school, but felt absolutely right in the moment. She pushed the A-10 into a steep dive, trading altitude for speed and accepting the increased risk from ground fire in exchange for cutting her time to target. Neptune 7, Reaper 1, 30 seconds to visual contact. Prepare to mark target with smoke or laser designation. The world outside her cockpit became a blur of gray and brown as the A-10 dove toward the Earth at speeds that pushed the aircraft's design limits. Her altimeter unwound rapidly. 8,000 feet, 7,000, 6,000. At this rate of descent, she'd have perhaps one chance to identify and engage the enemy positions before she'd be forced to pull up or risk flying straight into the ground. At 4,000 feet, she finally achieved visual contact with the battle below. Muzzle flashes sparked from concealed positions arranged in a rough semicircle around a small rocky outcropping, where she could just make out the infrared strobes marking the SEAL team's position. The tactical situation was even worse than she'd imagined. The Americans were completely surrounded, pinned down in the open with minimal cover. Tally target area, she transmitted, beginning her attack run. Neptune 7, keep your heads down. The GAU-8 cannon came alive with a sound like the universe tearing itself apart. 7 barrels spun up to maximum rate, sending a stream of depleted uranium rounds downrange at velocities that defied comprehension. Each round was designed to penetrate tank armor. Against personnel in prepared positions, the effect was devastating. The sound reached the ground several seconds after the rounds themselves, a thunderous roar that announced the arrival of American air power. Her first pass neutralized the eastern machine gun nest, the position simply ceasing to exist under the impact of 30mm rounds traveling at nearly 3 times the speed of sound. But as she pulled up for another attack run, her radar warning receiver began screaming again. Multiple SAM launches, missiles in the air and tracking toward her aircraft. Reaper threw the A-10 into a violent evasive maneuver, dispensing chaff and flares while simultaneously trying to maintain visual contact with the ground battle. She could see the missile contrails streaking up from concealed positions, white fingers of death reaching toward her aircraft with single-minded purpose. The A-10's engines whined in protest as she pushed them beyond their normal operating parameters, trading engine life for the speed she needed to survive. The first missile passed close enough that she could see its guidance fins adjusting in real time, seeking the heat signature of her engines. Her countermeasures confused its seeker head just enough to send it careening past her left wingtip, exploding harmlessly in the air behind her. But there were others, and her luck couldn't hold forever against a determined enemy with modern weapons. Multiple SAMs in the air, she transmitted to anyone who might be listening. Reaper 1 is defensive. The second missile was better aimed, tracking her aircraft's heat signature despite her countermeasures. Reaper could see it approaching in her mirrors, a deadly dart of metal and explosive that represented years of enemy planning finally coming to fruition. She had perhaps 3 seconds to live unless she could find a way to break the missile's lock. She rolled the A-10 inverted and pulled the nose toward the Earth in a split-S maneuver that subjected both aircraft and pilot to forces approaching the limits of human endurance. The missile, unable to follow such an aggressive maneuver, streaked past overhead and self-destructed when it lost target lock. But the maneuver had cost her altitude and energy, leaving her dangerously low and slow in an environment where both were measured in heartbeats. Reaper 1, Neptune 7. Outstanding work on that gun run. Eastern position is neutralized. Can you engage the western machine gun nest? Still alive, still flying, still fighting. Reaper pulled the A-10 out of its dive barely 500 feet above the deck, the aircraft shuddering as it transitioned from falling object back to flying machine. She could see the muzzle flashes from the western position, could almost feel the weight of American expectations pressing down on her shoulders like a physical force. Roger, Neptune 7, rolling in from the south. Mark your position and keep your heads down. Her second attack run came in low and fast, skimming the Earth at altitudes that would have been suicidal in any other aircraft. But the Thunderbolt II had been designed for exactly this kind of flying, low, slow, and close enough to the enemy to look them in the eyes before pulling the trigger. The western machine gun nest disappeared under another burst of 30mm fire, its occupants having perhaps 1 second to comprehend their fate before it arrived. As she pulled up from the attack run, Reaper caught sight of movement in her peripheral vision. Another missile launch, this one from a position she hadn't previously identified. The SAM sight had waited until she was committed to her attack run before revealing itself, a patient predator that had finally decided to strike. This missile was different from the others, its trajectory suggesting a more sophisticated guidance system and higher probability of kill. Reaper could see that her previous tactics wouldn't work against this threat. It was tracking her aircraft's radar signature rather than just heat, making it immune to conventional countermeasures. She had one option left, and it was certifiably insane. Instead of climbing away from the missile, she dove toward it, using the A-10's superior maneuverability to force the SAM into an intercept geometry it hadn't been designed to handle. The missile's proximity fuse triggered when she passed within lethal range, but her violent maneuvering had thrown off its aim just enough to save her life. Shrapnel peppered her aircraft's armored hull, but the A-10's legendary toughness absorbed the damage without losing any critical systems. Reaper 1, you still with us? The voice from Neptune 7 carried genuine concern mixed with amazement. Still here, she replied, conducting a rapid damage assessment while simultaneously searching for additional threats. How's your tactical situation? Much improved thanks to you. We've got 2 positions remaining. Looks like RPG teams in the rocks about 300 meters north of our position. Can you see them? Reaper adjusted her heading and began climbing back to attack altitude, her eyes scanning the terrain below for any sign of the remaining enemy forces. The A-10's targeting systems had taken some damage from the missile fragments, but she could still see well enough to identify threats visually. Old-school flying in an aircraft built for exactly this kind of punishment. The RPG teams were well concealed among the rocky outcroppings, their positions chosen with the kind of tactical awareness that suggested professional military training rather than amateur insurgents. These weren't farmers with rifles. They were soldiers who understood how to fight against American air power and who had planned this ambush with considerable sophistication. I see them, she transmitted, lining up for what would probably be her final attack run. Her fuel state was approaching the point where she'd need to begin thinking about the flight home, and her ammunition was running low after the previous engagements. This would have to count. The Maverick missile came off the rail with a distinctive whoosh, its imaging infrared seeker head locking onto the heat signature of the enemy position. The weapon was designed to kill tanks, but it would be more than adequate for troops in the open. Reaper watched the missile track toward its target, a white contrail marking its path through the gray morning air. The explosion sent a pillar of dust and debris into the sky, visible even from her altitude several thousand feet above the battlefield. When the dust cleared, there was nothing left of the position except scattered rocks and the kind of silence that indicated the fight had gone out of the enemy forces. Neptune 7, this is Reaper 1. I show negative movement from that position. How copy? Roger, Reaper 1. Outstanding work. The remaining hostiles appear to be withdrawing to the north. We are no longer taking effective fire. For the first time since launching from forward operating base Kestrel, Reaper allowed herself to breathe normally. The immediate crisis had passed, the Americans were safe, and she still had enough fuel to make it home. But as she began a slow orbit above the battlefield, her radar warning receiver lit up one final time. A new SAM site had appeared on her scope, this one positioned directly along her planned route home. Someone had anticipated her withdrawal path and positioned a final trap to ensure that even if she saved the SEAL team, she wouldn't live to tell about it. The enemy had planned this operation with a level of sophistication that suggested state-level sponsorship and intelligence support. Neptune 7, be advised I'm showing additional SAM activity along my egress route. You may want to expedite your extraction. Copy Reaper 1. We've got a ride inbound, ETA 10 minutes. Can you maintain overwatch until our pickup arrives? 10 minutes. Reaper checked her fuel gauge and calculated whether she had enough to loiter over the battlefield and still make it home safely. The numbers were tight, but doable if she managed her fuel consumption carefully, and if the final SAM site didn't force her into fuel-consuming evasive maneuvers. Roger, Neptune 7. I'll maintain overwatch until your ride arrives. She settled into a holding pattern above the battlefield. The A-10's engines throttled back to conserve fuel while still maintaining enough airspeed to maneuver if threatened. Below, she could see the SEAL team moving to a more defensible position, their infrared strobes still marking their location for the extraction aircraft that would soon arrive to take them home. The radio crackled with the voice of the incoming extraction helicopter, a Black Hawk whose crew was undoubtedly wondering what they were flying into. Neptune 7, this is Dustoff 7-2 inbound your position. What's the tactical situation? Dustoff 7-2, Neptune 7. LZ is secure thanks to outstanding close air support from Reaper 1. Be advised there may be residual SAM threats in the area. Reaper watched the Black Hawk appear as a small dot on the horizon, growing larger as it approached the battlefield at low altitude and high speed. The helicopter's crew was flying the kind of profile that indicated they understood the risks, but were committed to completing the mission regardless. She knew that feeling intimately. Dustoff 7-2, this is Reaper 1. I have you in sight and will provide overwatch during your approach and departure. Much appreciated, Reaper 1. We heard about your work down there. Outstanding job. The extraction proceeded smoothly, the Black Hawk touching down just long enough for the SEAL team to scramble aboard before lifting off again and disappearing toward the south. Reaper maintained her orbit until the helicopter was well clear of the area, then began her own egress toward home. The final SAM site remained stubbornly active on her scope, its radar painting her aircraft with targeting energy but not yet launching. Perhaps they were waiting for her to fly directly overhead, or perhaps they were conserving their missiles for more valuable targets. Either way, she would have to deal with them before she could safely return to base. Instead of flying directly toward the threat, Reaper chose a more circuitous route that would take her around the SAM site's effective range. It would cost precious fuel, but it was preferable to flying straight into another missile engagement when her aircraft was already damaged and her ammunition nearly exhausted. The flight home passed in relative quiet, the A-10's engines maintaining their steady rhythm as she navigated through increasingly poor weather back toward forward operating base Kestrel. Only when she finally established radio contact with the tower did she allow herself to believe that she would actually make it home alive. Tower, this is Reaper 1 inbound with battle damage, requesting priority approach and emergency vehicles standing by. Reaper 1, Tower, we have you on radar. Emergency vehicles are standing by. You're cleared for straighten approach runway 27. Winds now 260 at 20, gusting to 30. The landing was routine despite the battle damage, the A-10 touching down on the centerline with its characteristic authority. As she taxied toward the parking area, Reaper could see Rodriguez and his maintenance crew waiting with expressions that mixed relief with professional concern for their aircraft. She shut down the engines and climbed out of the cockpit on legs that felt less steady than she would have preferred. The adrenaline was finally wearing off, leaving behind the familiar empty feeling that followed successful combat missions. 7 years of war, and it never got easier, just more familiar. Rodriguez was already examining the missile damage to her aircraft's hull, his experienced eye cataloging each piece of shrapnel and calculating what it would take to return the A-10 to flight status. Jesus, Reaper, looks like you tangled with a buzz saw up there. Something like that, she replied, pulling off her helmet and running her fingers through sweat-matted hair. How long until she's ready to fly again? Give me 48 hours and she'll be good as new, maybe better. Rodriguez's voice carried the kind of pride that came from keeping aircraft flying in impossible conditions. I heard about what you did up there, words already getting around. Before she could respond, Major Davidson appeared at her elbow, his expression unreadable in the gray morning light. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of the mission hanging between them like smoke from a distant fire. "Well done, Sergeant," he said finally. "I've already received preliminary reports from Neptune 7. They're recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross." Reaper nodded acknowledgement but felt no particular satisfaction from the praise. Medals were nice, but they didn't bring back the dead or heal the wounded. They were just metal and ribbon, tokens of appreciation from a grateful nation that would forget the details long before the recipients did. "Permission to debrief and get some chow, sir." "Granted, but Vasquez," Davidson paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "There's been some talk about your unconventional approach to mission execution. Some people think you take unnecessary risks." She looked at him steadily, wondering if this was the moment when her career would take another sideways step toward some desk job in the rear echelon. "Sir, I did what was necessary to complete the mission and bring our people home. If that's considered risky, then maybe we need to reconsider what acceptable risk looks like in combat." Davidson studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I think you're right, Sergeant. Get some food and rest. Something tells me we'll be needing your services again soon." As he walked away, Reaper remained beside her aircraft, one hand resting on its battle-scarred hull. The A-10 had brought her home safely once again, its ungainly appearance hiding the kind of combat effectiveness that had made it legendary among ground forces worldwide. Tomorrow, Rodriguez and his crew would patch the holes and reload the weapons, preparing the aircraft for whatever mission came next. But for now, she was content to stand in the gray Afghan morning, listening to the wind carry the sounds of a war that never seemed to end. Somewhere to the north, the SEAL team she'd saved was probably already planning their next mission, their brief encounter with mortality filed away as just another day at the office. That was how it worked in this business. Today's heroes became tomorrow's footnotes, replaced by new faces and fresh crises. She thought about the voices on the radio, the fear and determination she'd heard in those transmissions from Neptune 7. They'd trusted her to bring the rain when they needed it most, and she delivered. That was enough. That was everything. The sound of approaching rotors announced the arrival of another mission, another crisis somewhere in the endless expanse of hostile territory that surrounded their small outpost of American influence. Reaper looked up to see a formation of Black Hawks heading north, carrying more young Americans toward whatever dangers waited in the gray distance. Rodriguez finished his preliminary damage assessment and walked over to where she stood. "You know, Reaper, I've been working on combat aircraft for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what you did up there today. Flying through that SAM engagement like it was just another training exercise." "It wasn't bravery," she replied quietly. "It was just the job." "Maybe, but I've seen a lot of pilots do the job over the years, and most of them would have turned around after the first missile launch. You kept going back until the mission was complete." He was right, of course, though she didn't see it that way. In her mind, turning around had never been an option. Not with American lives hanging in the balance, not with voices on the radio counting on her to be better than the enemy was smart. That was the contract she'd signed when she put on the uniform, to be the person others could count on when everything else fell apart. The debriefing session lasted 3 hours. Intelligence officers and tactical analysts dissecting every aspect of the mission, with the kind of methodical precision that characterized military post-mission analysis. They wanted to understand how the enemy had positioned their forces, how they'd coordinated the ambush, what it meant for future operations in the region. Reaper answered their questions with the same attention to detail she brought to flying, but part of her mind remained focused on the larger implications of what had happened. The enemy was getting smarter, more sophisticated in their tactics and equipment. Today's mission had been a preview of tomorrow's challenges, and she wasn't sure the American military was adapting quickly enough to meet them. When the debriefing finally ended, she made her way to the chow hall, suddenly aware that she hadn't eaten anything since the previous evening. The facility was nearly empty except for a few night shift personnel grabbing coffee before heading to their posts. She sat alone at a corner table, mechanically consuming a meal that tasted like nothing at all. "Mind if I join you?" Reaper looked up to see Captain Jennifer "Torch" Morrison, one of the few other female pilots on the base. Morrison flew Apache attack helicopters and had a reputation for precision that matched her call sign. She could put a Hellfire missile through a window at 3 miles and frequently did. "Free country," Reaper replied, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. Morrison sat down with her own meal, studying Reaper's face with the kind of professional interest that one combat pilot reserves for another. "I heard about your mission this morning. Word is you went through some serious air defenses to get to those SEALs." "Just did what needed doing." "That's what they all say. But not everyone would have pressed the attack after the first SAM launch, let alone stayed around for a second and third pass." Reaper pushed food around her plate, not particularly interested in rehashing the mission, but understanding that Morrison needed to hear the story. Combat pilots talk to each other because nobody else could truly understand the particular pressures and decisions that came with flying in harm's way. "The enemy had good intelligence and better equipment than we expected," she said finally. "They knew exactly when and where to position their forces for maximum effect. If I hadn't pressed the attack, those SEALs would still be pinned down, probably dead by now." Morrison nodded, recognizing the truth in that assessment. "Intelligence thinks this was a probe, testing our response times and capabilities. If that's true, then what you did today probably saved a lot of lives beyond just that SEAL team." It was possible, Reaper supposed. In asymmetric warfare, every engagement was both tactical and strategic, providing intelligence and lessons that would influence future operations. Today's successful mission might deter tomorrow's ambush, or it might prompt the enemy to develop even more sophisticated countermeasures. You ever think about what we're really accomplishing out here? Morrison asked, her voice dropping to the kind of quiet tone reserved for conversations that could be misinterpreted by the wrong people. Reaper considered the question carefully. It was the kind of inquiry that could get complicated quickly, touching on politics and policy decisions that were well above her pay grade. But Morrison was asking as one pilot to another, seeking honest perspective rather than official talking points. "I think about the voices on the radio," she said finally. "When someone calls for help and trusts you to come through for them, the bigger questions become secondary. Maybe we're not solving Afghanistan's problems, but we're bringing Americans home alive. That's enough for me." Morrison smiled, the first genuine expression Reaper had seen from her in months. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. There's something I want to talk to you about, but not here. Can you meet me at the flight line in an hour?" Intrigued despite her fatigue, Reaper agreed to the meeting. After Morrison left, she finished her meal in contemplative silence, wondering what conversation required that level of discretion. In her experience, anything discussed on the flight line, rather than in official spaces, usually involved either rule-bending or the kind of creative problem-solving that superior officers preferred not to know about in advance. An hour later, she found Morrison standing beside her Apache helicopter, its angular silhouette stark against the gray Afghan sky. The aircraft was armed and fueled, suggesting that Morrison had her own mission approaching and wanted to discuss something before launching. "There's a situation developing," Morrison began without preamble. "Intelligence has identified a high-value target compound about 60 kilometers north of here. Someone with connections to the group that organized today's ambush against Neptune 7. Reaper waited for Morrison to continue, sensing that the real conversation was just beginning. Around them, the flight line buzzed with the controlled chaos of a forward operating base preparing for night operations. Ground crews moved between aircraft, conducting maintenance and loading weapons for missions that would launch as soon as darkness provided adequate concealment. "The target is heavily defended," Morrison continued. "Surface-to-air missiles, coordinated air defenses, the works. Intelligence thinks it might be a regional command.